Welcome back to Moments That Matter. This week we join back up with Dr. Paul Schatzberger for part 2 of our discussion on his new book, A Love Letter to Twentysomethings Everywhere. If you haven't gotten your copy, you can find a couple of links in the podcast description where you can get a paperback, hardback, and most recently, the Kindle format. Let's pick back up where we left off last week. Another big ticket item on the schedules of 20-somethings deal with that magical relationship of finding someone with whom to spend their life. And you included a little bit about that as well. You wrote of your meeting and marrying your wife. And I've met your wife, and you two have such an incredible relationship all these years later. I know you do lots of marriage counseling and have often served as a source of great wisdom for those growing in depth with a significant other. What would be some counsel that you would give today in 2022 to people seeking a relationship within our current social constructs?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is an interesting subject these days, because this is one of the things that's being put off, for fear of adulting, and in particular for fear of making a mistake. So the more that you see around you of failure, and in particular, in this case, failed marriages, either friends or family or whoever it might be, the less likely it is that you are going to want to try that out for yourself. But I do try, when I talk to couples, I do try to say, if you know, it's not something that is just some kind of feeling or something like that. If you know in your spirit that this is the person for you, then there's little really that should stand in the way of that, including and especially timing, because there is no perfect timing. And so, people will say, oh, well, I have to finish school. I have to, start my career. I have to do blah, 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 and the truth is God will take care of you. God will provide. If this is the one that he is, blessed you with, then he'll take care of the rest. You just go ahead and get married. And one of the things I tell couples is I don't think it's a particularly good idea to go beyond a year or so with your engagement. But at the same time, you need time to plan, so probably maybe not something less than, 4 or 5 months or something like that. Because I also do, as you mentioned, think the premarital counseling is terribly important. There are some things that really need to be talked out, and some couples are very good about these things, and talking to each other and, well, what do you think about this issue, that kind of thing. And then some couples are absolutely terrible about it. And so there is a lot that still needs to be kind of uncovered, if you will, in premarital counseling, especially about their backgrounds and especially about their family. That's a lot of what it kind of comes down to, because what you see modeled to you oftentimes is what you resort to in your relationship. And how, for a guy, what was his father like? For a girl, what was his mother like? So to kind of uncover that stuff ahead of time and say, okay, you see going in, what this dynamic was like. Is this something that you want in your relationship, or do you really kind of need to think a little bit differently about that? That I think is terribly important. But another aspect is the spiritual gifting of each. And that really doesn't get talked about too much these days, unfortunately. How do the giftings work together, and how do we value the giftings when they're so terribly different from each other? So what I say in the book is, that we get married valuing the differences, and really respecting the fact that this other person has such different ways of looking at the world and different kinds of perspectives and experiences. But somehow during the course of marriage, it becomes a liability. And then we start thinking, well, why aren't they more like me? That kind of thing. So again, just trying to head that off a little bit with the premarital counseling and say, what is it that you value and how is it that you can keep on valuing that? And it's a huge challenge for everyone who is married. But just to be aware of these things, these things are coming. And because when you've got, new love and stars in your eyes and everything else like that, these are not things that necessarily will occur to you. So I think those are probably the major things that I would counsel people about.
Yeah, those are great. And I did really like that part that you included in the book about the differences. I grew up in sort of as a product of the I Kiss Dating Goodbye stream.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I feel like there was a significant emphasis on you better not mess this up. You have got to make sure every single star in the universe aligns before you even think about
Mm-hmm.
taking one step.
Yeah.
And so maybe in the abundance of caution, and because I was incredibly and still am socially awkward and an Enneagram type 5, which is the worst of all types to try and fall in love with someone, it was quite late in my life. I didn't get married until I was 30. But I feel like your words were a great balance to that counsel of being so overly cautious that you don't make any movement to just being led by the Spirit. I think it's different now. It's so interesting how relationships form and communicate. I remember when I was a kid seeing in the classified section of the newspaper, and for those who may be listening, the newspaper was a large. No, I'm just kidding. That's terrible. When I was a kid, I remember seeing newspapers. I think they still have some in big cities that had classified ads of people seeking other people, and now everything's online, and people have such a great deal of interaction in this virtual world. Do you find that your counsel has changed any because of how people meet and interact here in 2022?
No, I really have not. Um, I think that relationships are relationships, no matter how they start and no matter how people find each other. I do think it's amazing the ways in which God brings people together, and often uh, opposites, and how they do attract, and the whole thing is very fascinating to me. One thing I do want to say, just kind of about the book in general, that has to do with this is there are many things that I present in there that are, um, potentially, I guess you could look at them as dangerous situations or possibly something that people would shy away from. The subject of miracles is in there. Some kind of, near accidents and accidents that have happened um, that, if you look at them, you say, oh, well, that's not anything I want to do, and so I won't, opt for those things, whatever it might be, that career or, that relationship or something like that. And what I hope is coming across in the book is to be bold and very courageous, as God says to Joshua. Um, there's always the chance for failure. There's always the chance that things won't work out. Certainly, you can't look at all the stories that I talk about in the book and think that it's just been a bed of roses. Uh, Even the really really good things required some faith and some belief. And again, I think about the chapter on miracles that um, just putting yourself in the situation in which those kinds of miracles can happen. And so I am really trying to encourage, without necessarily beating people over the head with it, to put yourself out there and really take a chance. And as with marriage, if you know, and you go ahead and do it, and you start living life together, and then you'll figure things out. Not you figure things out, and then, then you get married or whatever. So I hope that is something that comes from the book. Maybe a little bit more courage, a little bit more boldness to explore the things that God has for us.
Yeah, very well said. And that's an excellent segue to something else I was going to ask you, because in that same vein, peppered throughout your book were really incredible stories of how God showed up in your life in significant ways. And personally, I find that we humans tend to have these great experiences where God reveals himself, and then we quickly forget. And reading your stories reminded me of so many times that I had sort of forgotten how God showed up in these really incredible ways, maybe sometimes at the midnight hour, in ways that truly gave him glory and advanced what he was seeking to do in my life. But what would you say are a couple of your favorite stories of how God has personally ministered to you in unexpected ways that you included in this book?
Well, the chapter on miracles, it starts with actually a healing miracle for me. And it was a healing that I desperately needed. It was for my back, and I was having all sorts of kind of problems with that. And it was quite debilitating at times. I needed healing, but I didn't know how in the world it would happen. I sought out a chiropractor. There was some relief there, but then I had an accident and it started all over again. And I just didn't see any way out of it. And what happened was completely unexpected. It was just, God healed my back in a moment, literally within 20 minutes, laying on a table in the chiropractor's office. Never needed a chiropractor again. My back has been very healthy, and it's not something that I prayed specifically for, but it's something that I longed for. How about that? And it taught me a lot about how God sees us. We really don't think we're worthy of a miracle, or we aren't worthy to be involved in a miracle, for someone else or something like that. And I don't know quite where all that comes from, the psychology of it and everything else like that. But I learned from that experience and from others that, and please pardon me for putting it this way. I don't mean to offend anyone, but we're all God's God. We talk about being the hands and feet of Jesus. Well, we're it. If we're not doing it and we're not involved in these things, then who is? Well, it's another human being. So why isn't it you? Why isn't it me? And I honestly believe if we turn God down, then he will just make the offer to someone else. So we should take him up on his offers. And again, I come back to that boldness thing, and say, okay, if in fact human beings are all God has, in terms of the day-to-day work of the kingdom on this earth, then don't I want to be one of those people that is doing that work? And it's nothing you can predict. I've never been able to predict, what God will do. I just simply put myself in situations, and in some cases in extremis, where God had to do something. So I talk about praying for people in Ukraine and having them healed. I talk about being in Nicaragua and handing out toys to children and knowing that they were going to run out, and yet they never did. And I also talk about it's slightly less miraculous, but nonetheless, it was stunning when it happened. God's provision of taking care of us in trying to sell the apartment that we had bought in Ukraine when we came back after being missionaries. It was just so unexpected, and the way it happened, and so kind of God to work things out in our favor, and exactly the time that we needed it. That I couldn't possibly think that it was us that did any of that, that it was me that did any of that. And that to me is a great situation to be in, to know that it's not you, that it is in fact God. And that stays with you. And these stories have stayed with me. And these are the milestone events, these are the Ebenezer stones, that we raise, and we say, God was at work right here in my life. Thus far God has helped me, and I just think that those experiences are so terribly important, that when we are not willing to enter in, and when we're not willing to be courageous, and to take a chance, then we just miss out on those markers. We miss out on those milestones. And it's harder and harder to convince ourselves that we matter in the kingdom. All of us want to feel like we matter to another person, to God, to his work. And it's really hard to convince ourselves of that when we're not willing to enter into the thing that God has given us to do, because of fear, because we don't think it'll work out, because we think we're going to fail, whatever it might be. And I'm not the boldest person in the world, at all, and I'm not a risk taker at all. I'm not even outgoing at all. But I know those times when God puts that challenge in front of me, or that invitation is probably a nicer way of saying it. And I know that if I just keep saying yes, then God will bless it.
I love what you said, and that might have been my favorite chapter in the book because it was so personal to me. I've seen similar things as you had mentioned on the mission field, especially because of our mutual love for mission work and other countries and seeing how God's moving there. We've seen a lot of the same things, and really seeing God demonstrate his love for people. And I love the way you say that we're all God has. And it almost sounds too brazen and too bold to make a statement like that until we remember that in the book of Acts, an angel shows up to Cornelius, tells him what great favor he has in God's eyes, and to send for Peter, and Peter will answer his questions. And yet here's an angel who appeared to Cornelius, who has been in the presence of God for who knows how many thousands of years and knows the answers to everything Cornelius could ask. And yet it's the human agent that delivers the message of the gospel. And I so loved that chapter because it revealed what possibilities are ours when we make room for God's presence in our lives. And maybe how many things we miss because we don't make room for God's presence. And I love the thought of what possibilities are before us if we recognize that we are co-laborers with Christ and co-laborers with one another in what he's doing. Well, you conclude your book with a topic that touches, I think, a deep need that we all have, not only to believe that we matter to God and that we matter to one another, but also the idea of hearing and responding to God's voice. This is something that I so wished that I had a better understanding of when I was finishing up my time in college and trying to figure out what in the world I was supposed to do with my life, that God actually speaks to his people, and he longs for us to hear his voice and to communicate with him. What would be maybe some practical truths that you shared in the book, especially regarding how to perceive God, how to hear God, how to respond to the invitations that he brings us.
Well, I do want to say that that last chapter is based on a book that I used as the basis for a course in Ukraine, and it's called Knowing God's Voice and Will. And they just kind of go step by step through the process of hearing God's voice and responding to God's voice and that kind of thing. And what I do is adapt it to Mary's encounter with the angel Gabriel. And so if they talk about, as an example, God gets our attention, well, the angel says, greetings, favored woman, the Lord is with you, that kind of thing. And then God gives us a revelation. We respond with hesitation. We finally yield to God's plan. We receive verification, and we glorify God. So I just break down the experience of Mary and say that it's okay to have questions. It's okay not to know how things are going to work out. But at the end of the day, we need to accede to God, and we need to say, okay, this is your plan, so I'm going to agree with your plan. And God has to get the glory out of it. Bottom line. And so I contrast Mary's experience with Zachariah's, Zachariah, who would be the father of John the Baptist, because up to a certain point, their experiences were absolutely identical. So they get this announcement, and how can this be, that sort of thing. But then they kind of veer off from each other, and Zachariah's just got almost a demand for an explanation from this angel who's appearing to him, which I never really understood about, visions with angels and how you exactly demand an explanation from an angel. But anyway, and the angel gets actually quite upset with him and says, okay, you're not going to buy this, you're not going to believe this, so you're not going to speak either, until your son's born. And so there is this delay in giving glory to God. Mary's was immediate. She said, be it unto me as you have said. But then she goes and meets her relative Elizabeth, and Elizabeth, talks about the baby that's in Mary's womb, and then Mary gives this Magnificat, and it is this ultimate glorification of God. That happened shortly after the angels appearing. With Zechariah, had to go through that whole time until John the Baptist was born, and then finally he was able to speak, and then he gives glory to God. And one of my points in the chapter is we need to hear, we need to respond to what we believe God is telling us, but God also needs to get the glory, and sometimes we leave that part out. We are so happy to be used by God, and we're so happy to be part of God's plan, and we're so happy for things to work out so well, and for us to be blessed and that kind of thing. We forget sometimes that it's really all about God. It's never been about us. And so if God is not getting glory, then there's something wrong with the plan on our part. And so I just try to get across that idea in the chapter.
Very good. That was very, very good. And I think that ended the chapter well. I wonder if you would be so kind for myself and our listeners to maybe read a selection from your book that would be one of your favorite passages that'll give us a little bit of a flavor of the love letter to 20-somethings everywhere.
Well, Uh, One of the things that I think affects us a great deal, and probably more than we're willing to admit, is how we were raised and who our parents are. Um, and for me, my father was bigger than life, and he affected every part of my life. He affected the dream that I had early on of going into the Navy. He affected um, how I looked at life, my perspective, and everything else like that. Um, but there were some things that needed to be kind of overcome as a result of that. And one of the things was that he was so bigger than life that there were these expectations that sometimes were just not terribly realistic. Um, and when he died, there was a void left of a couple different kinds. One is, sort of lacking a direction, rudder, if you will, for life. But the other is, what do I do with all of this frustration and in some cases anger because of these unrealistic expectations and the expectation for perfection? Um, so had to deal with all of that when my father passed away. So there's just a little bit of that chapter. A difficult thing about losing someone so influential in our lives is that we don't just lose them once. That's how the world imagines it, but it's not true. The world sees our loss taking place on a single day, and the funeral and the grief taking place on another day. But we lose these significant people over and over, day after day, sometimes for years. In one way, this is honoring to the person who died. We don't want them to be quickly forgotten, so at least initially the grief can feel appropriate and necessary. There's some undefinable crossroad, however, where we begin to drown in loss and sadness, and depression consumes our lives. Eventually, a kind of rigor mortis sets in, and we realize that we have also died. For the next year and a half following Dad's funeral, I muddled my way through life, staying busy, hiding my loss in activity. In August 1995, there was a celebration of the 50th anniversary of BJ Day in Wilmington, North Carolina, at the site of the USS North Carolina battleship. My father had served on Taro Island in the Pacific War, and I wanted to represent him at the ceremony. Rather than having a typical wreath laying at a cemetery, service members on board the battleship took turns throwing wreaths into the river, one for each branch of service, as a bugler played taps. Some World War II vintage bombers and fighters flew over the battleship, and the commemoration ended. The ceremony was heartfelt and very moving. My father would have enjoyed being there along with the many veterans in attendance. Once home, I read it in the newspaper that the aircraft used in the flyover would depart the Wilmington airport the next day at a particular time. Somehow I knew I had to be there. This, it turned out, was a day for promises. I settled onto a promontory overlooking the airport as the aircraft engines were turning up. One by one, they took to the sky, first the fighters, then the bombers. The last to leave was the largest of the airplanes, a B-17 Flying Fortress, the aircraft most responsible for the Allied victory in Europe. It lumbered down the runway and lifted heavily into the air, its landing gear tucking into the tired body of the aircraft. As the plane disappeared in the distance, I sensed I was watching the spirit of my father departing the earth. God spoke to my spirit, "This is the end. It's time to move on." Those planes represented my father's generation, the greatest generation, and now that generation was fading away. The strange thing was, unlike at the funeral, no tears came to my eyes. It was an end, but it was also a beginning, a new promise. There was only hope in my heart that God was back at the controls of my life, assuring me everything would be all right. The weight of the previous 2 years lifted from my shoulders. I could breathe again.
Beautiful. Thank you. That was one of my favorite parts as well, having lost my own father and recognizing that process of working through grief that doesn't end after one day. Indeed. Wow, very good. So, is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know about this latest work, or anything else you'd like to add?
Um, just that I hope that they find it accessible. And if they are, in fact, not a 20 something, that they might think about those 20 somethings in their lives that might benefit from a book like this. It's not long. None of my books are. And it's, I hope, easy to read. And I hope, actually, also, it's going to be coming out in audio form. My brother, of all people, has shown a willingness to narrate the book. And this is, as it turns out, a desire of his, has been a desire for a long time. And this is his opportunity to, show his stuff to Audible. So suddenly, my brother and I have been brought together on this project, and he's 10 years older than I am, and we live in different parts of the country, and it's actually kind of sweet the way it's worked out.
Speaking of accessibility, what is the best place to get this book?
Well, there's two sites right now. One is Amazon, and they have, for whatever reason, when you do a search, it seems to come up with the hardback first, and I don't even know how there is a hardback. But if you kind of search down a little bit, it'll give you a link for the paperback. There should be a Kindle version coming out in the next couple of weeks, and that'll be on Amazon. And then Wipfenstock, WIPF and stock.com is the publisher, and they also have it on their site.
Excellent. And I did see the hardcover, and I was excited that we have lots of options: hardcover, softcover, digital. Glad to hear that's coming. Can we talk for just a quick second about the cover? It looks amazing. Love the design. You sketched that out in another one of your midnight drawing sessions, or
it
came
not even close. Not even close. No, I have learned with Wipfenstock that they have some incredibly talented cover designers, and in this case, the woman's name is Shannon Carter. She is actually credited on the back, but I wish everyone could see the original design for this, because the book doesn't even capture it, how beautiful the thing is. But nonetheless, yeah, I was obviously super pleased with what she came up with.
Yeah, it does look great, and so exciting for this latest book. It is out now. It is available, and I thank you, Dr. Paul Schatzberger. Newest book, A Love Letter to 20-somethings Everywhere. Yes, you can, adult, and we'll look forward to hearing other great reports from it. Thanks so much for sharing with us today, and thank you to our listeners who've joined in for yet another season, yet another episode, and look forward to hearing back from perhaps you as you read this book and are blessed by it. Thank you so much. We'll see you next episode. Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.